So the acronym TESCREAL, coined and disseminated by philosopher Émile P. Torres and computer scientist Timnit Gebru in 2023, circumscribes and critiques various interrelated approaches to the future of AI and space travel, expounded by the usual parade of overconfident white men of a certain age, with a penchant for eugenicist ideas with a happy ending. It stands for transhumanism, extropianism, Singularitarianism, Cosmism, Rationalism, Effective-Altruism and Long-termism. It also captures and delineates what we could otherwise describe as the phallic enjoyment of technocapitalism, or simply as Lacan put it, the jouissance of the idiot. So the central tenets that these fellow travellers converge around are as follows: the belief in the potential for unlimited augmentation of the human being and its body, the belief in the transcendence of the human being from its singular body into a cosmic one, the belief in the possibility of a future wherein superior humans live a life of maximum happiness and pleasure, and ultimately the idea that there exists in a distant utopia a much better version of human life yet to be experienced. And what they all have in common at heart is something which psychoanalysis recognizes all too well: the always already thwarted desire for the augmented human being, the organism completely fulfilled, bursting with vitality, pleasure, and potentiality at all times. In short, a total body. But this is a fantasy propped up and perpetuated by countless fictional depictions of the future of AI and our dalliances into space. Fantasies which often forego many fascinating psychological and conceptual aspects of these imagined worlds. Netflix adaptation of Liu Xijian's The Three-Body Problem being just one recent example of how phallic fantasies of AI and other non-human forms of intelligence obscure the psychoanalytic and philosophical complexity of how the human subject copes with the potential, not just of advanced technologies, but how this implies our whole relationship to time and space. The three-body problem deals with the question of what happens when humans make contact with alien civilization, and is named as such after the central theoretical conceit of the book, which is that when three celestial bodies are in close proximity to one another, it leads to a highly unstable and unpredictable state in astrodynamics. So the descriptively named Trisolarians are an alien civilization who live under these conditions of environmental chaos. In fact, they're a planet with 3 suns, approximately 4 light years away from Earth. They are intent on invading and conquering Earth so that they can live under its favorable environmental and cosmic conditions. In the Netflix adaptation of the trilogy Remembrance of Earth's Past, of which The Three-Body Problem is the first volume, we and the lead characters of the show meet the Trisolarians, known in the Netflix series as Santi, and interchangeably referred to throughout the talk, in the present day in what appears to be a virtual reality game. The game challenges the players to find the solution to their planet's cosmological fate, namely to solve the three-body problem, which is periodically wiping out their whole civilization due to extreme weather conditions on the planet. The population is either burnt to a crisp or frozen, as we witness every time a player loses the game. The protagonists soon realize that while this is an AI representation of reality, the species of Trisolarians is in fact real and are communicating with planet Earth and has been for some time. The game is a result of a collaboration between humans and Trisolarians, as we shall discover. So the TV series begins in 1966 in the context of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, at the scene of a Maoist struggle session, where an eminent physicist is publicly humiliated and then beaten to death for teaching Western science, while his wife denounces him on stage and his daughter looks on horrified from the baying crowd. We then follow the story of the daughter, Yi Wenji, also an astrophysicist, as she is taken to a labor camp in Inner Mongolia and then later to a shadowy science project on the outskirts of the camp where her superior intelligence is called upon. It emerges that the project's aim is to search for signs of extraterrestrial civilizations with an off-planet communication system, and Yi will be one of the first to receive a message from the Trisolarians. A messenger of the Trisolarians warns her, however, not to reply, as this will result in a catastrophe for humanity. She nonetheless responds by averring that humanity can't save itself and she'll help them with the invasion. It's this initial contact that then gives rise to the present-day story that follows a group of young Oxford scientists who are brought together after recent experiments started to defy the laws of physics, and a string of scientists around the world mysteriously kill themselves, including their teacher, Vera Yi, who, it turns out, is the daughter of Yi Wenji. So these suicides are being investigated by ex-policeman Da Shi, who reports to a mysterious figure, Thomas Wade, the head of a shadowy organization whose purported aim is to preserve humanity from what we don't yet know. It will emerge that the Trisolarians have made this advanced virtual reality technology available to humans because they forge an alliance with some factions on planet Earth. The game is a recruitment tool to this alliance. The Earth Trisolis organization, as they are known, rests on the superior nature of the Santi technology on the one hand, and the stable nature of the Earth's environment on the other. Both parties therefore rely on each other for their survival. However, the humans form, surprise, surprise, a cultish attachment to them, viewing their contact with the Trisolarians as a form of salvation, and their communications being akin to speaking with their lord. So far, so intriguing. But as the professor of international relations, Chechen Zhang, notes, the series Cosmic Sociology has much in common with neorealism in international relations theory. In the second book of the trilogy, cosmic sociologist Luigi formulates a theory that humans and Trisolarians have developed a system of stable mutual deterrence owing to two self-evident axioms that Ye told him. One, that survival is a primal need of all citizens, and of all civilizations, and two, civilizations continuously grow and expand, but the universe remains constant. Following this, Liu develops the chain of suspicion and dark forest theory, which goes something like this. A cannot determine whether B is friend or foe, and furthermore, A cannot determine if B thinks A is friend or foe, and A can't be sure if B thinks A thinks B is friend or foe, and thus the chain of suspicion goes on. This in turn leads to the dark forest theory, which states that given this ultimate uncertainty and the spatio-temporal scale of the universe, which according to Liu Ji means that the difference in capabilities between civilizations is likely to be enormous and unpredictable, the dark forest theory posits that every civilization is like a hunter with a gun stalking in a dark forest. They must hide themselves and strike at the first sign of other life. So according to Zhang, this is in many ways a cosmic version of neorealist AIR theory, which posits that since survival is a state's greatest need, and since they can't be sure of the other state's intention, this insecurity is a defining feature of the international system. And given this paranoia is on a cosmic scale, in the case of humans and Trisolarians, Liu promises that if the Trisolarians ever launch an assault, he will broadcast the whereabouts of Trisolaris to the universe, exposing both of them to the threat of destruction from all other potential foes, which according to dark forest theory is literally everyone and anyone. Hence, mutual destruction is assured. So as Zheng points out, the themes of the series are endorsed and, some would say, being charitable, misconstrued to align with contemporary political concerns from an online, discursive and ideological formation in China known as the Industrial Party. Their basic tenets involve a firm belief in technological determinism and social Darwinism, and a contempt for anything moralistic, sentimental or idealistic. Simply put, a hyper-rationalist approach to political and social relations, which when put on a cosmic scale becomes quickly totalitarian. Essentially, what the universe of the three-body problem, at least in its televisual version, puts forward is a hyper-masculine game theory approach to our first contact with another planet. And this is further underscored in the books by the fact that some key characters come to represent cliched ideas of masculine and feminine qualities as being corollaries to the traditional rational, emotional, order, chaos dichotomy. In fact, in the book, it's precisely because human society becomes too feminized after a long period of stability and prosperity, i.e. too soft, democratic, not adversarial enough, that supposedly the Trisolarians gain an opportunity to take advantage of this weakness, ultimately leading us to self-destruction and catastrophe. So the parallels with contemporary right-wing critique of woke culture should become apparent. So for a story with so much theoretical complexity and so many fascinating scientific ideas about our interactions with other life forms, It's a shame that the political, philosophical, and not to say psychoanalytic dimensions are not fully explored in the TV series. Instead, as is what often happens with what we could call phallic sci-fi, we remain stuck at the level of IR, international relations theory, political homologies. Furthermore, what the drama of the story hinges on is essentially a technological race to the bottom. The Trisolarians are so advanced scientifically that they've managed to condense centuries worth of technological sophistication into what they call high-dimensional proton supercomputers, known as sophons, which have the ability to analyze and process every minuscule piece of information about observable human behavior, also to limit technological development so that they will not have been able to catch up, that humans won't be able to catch up with the Santi's sophistication in the time it takes them to reach the Earth. So a sort of cosmic panopticon. And so here comes the interesting and mystifying bit about the Trisolarians, at least as far as I'm concerned, which is that the only thing the Trisolarians can't seem to do, which the story hinges on, despite their enormous intelligence and scientific genius, is read minds. Hence, the last defense that humanity has against this impending threat from outer space is to employ the skills of what are termed wall facers. So wall facers are 3 individuals selected by the UN from the world's most intelligent minds, whom would be given unlimited resources and minimal scrutiny, and have the task of working on solutions to outwit the Trisolarians, or the Santi, before they reach Earth. But the catch is they can never make any of their findings public and can't communicate with each other or anyone else about their research. One of the lead characters is chosen to be a wall facer and refuses, but his display of dissatisfaction and rejection of the role is taken to be even greater proof of his qualification to be the perfect wall facer. So sort of Platonic guardian of the state, reluctant and honourable. So the question is, how can it be that a civilization with such mind-blowing sophisticated technology is stymied by the opacity of the human mind? Doesn't this tell us a lot about the conception of knowledge that is at play in this story? A conception of knowledge that, for psychoanalysis, represents the does not want to know of traditional science. And the reason that Lacan asked the question, what would a science be that included psychoanalysis within it? It's an idea of knowledge that demands total transparency because it seems to have no capacity to deal with ambiguity, polysemy, or paradox. And doesn't this allusion to the inability to read minds also chime with our data-obsessed culture and our psychologization and standardization of every aspect of the singular and opaque human psyche, the desire to make humans completely transparent and legible to the gaze of the computer eye? Much like fantasies of superior AI life forms touted by the likes of the TESCREAL crowd, many of the assumptions and characterizations about these alternative forms of intelligence reveal a major naivety about the complexity and paradoxes of human and so-called natural intelligence. The brain-computer analogy that's persistently relied upon to measure the so-called efficiency of thought seems not to recognize that computational thinking is a product of the brain and not the other way around. And secondly, that the brain is always attached to a body, and the body, as psychoanalysis teaches us, always fails. And this failure is fundamental to thought itself. Perhaps even more significant to the misunderstanding of human thinking by so many in the TESCREAL orbit is to do with our standard conceptions of the linear nature of thought, which for Lacan somewhat missed the mark of how perception worked. A certain retroactivity is always in play in speech and cognition, what he referred to as the future anterior. So for an exploration of this, I just want to turn briefly to another science fiction film, which I think really captures the point about how thought, speech, and language are intimately related, and how we perceive time and other forms of intelligence, may differ from us. So Denis Villeneuve's 2016 film Arrival tells the story of first contact with an alien race of kraken-like creatures called heptapods who've come to Earth, they tell us, to offer weapon, and the weapon they offer comes via the medium of language, which for the heptapods operates according to a completely different logic than that of spoken and written human language. The heptapods communicate by symbols, which they produce physically by spurting out black squid ink-like images called semigrams on a two-dimensional surface into the air with no linear sequence. So Louise Banks is the world-renowned linguist recruited by the military to decipher this language and work out what the heptapods really want and how they propose to help humans. In the process of learning their language, Louise experiences what appear to be flashbacks of the tragic death of her teenage daughter, so we think. In fact, the language that Louise is learning is not just enabling her to understand the heptapods and their desires better, but it's changing her whole experience of time and desire itself. The heptapods don't think in linear time through cause and effect in past, present, and future, but rather circular time, where all events happen simultaneously. Through learning this mode of thought, the heptapods give Louise, and by extension humanity, their help or weapon against the ravages of linear thinking. So her visions of her daughter's death are not flashbacks, but rather flash forwards of the child she will have with her colleague, Ian Donnelly, who is this Los Alamos physicist who she works with. So a feature often neglected by commentators on the film is the spatial and material nature of the heptapods' language. In the original short story, Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, Louise discerns that the heptapods' speech and writing have no relation to each other. She identifies two languages, one spoken and one written, heptapod A, speech, and heptapod B, writing. And whilst their alphabet is pictorial, it's not symbolic in the way that human languages are. It doesn't attempt to represent speech. The shapes that they create with the substance that they emit from their bodies exist topologically as relations of space and do not relate to the audible communication that they make with Louise. Their language exists as real in space, but not in time, a true sort of materialist position. And in order to decipher the semigrams, one must be able to perceive the structural coexistence of them all at once. Hence, the heptapods live out of time. So one wonders, given their apparent lapse in perfection, their allusion to a future time when they'll need the help of humans, are the sounds of the heptapods that making a crack in the circular logic of their thought, the cry, which effectively humanizes them and provokes them to engage with our temporal and finite universe. It must be that their perfect existence of plenitude and grace has been punctuated by the nightmare of temporality. In other words, do heptapods dream in depressingly linear fashion, the inverse of the human psyche? So by the end of the film, even though she discovers that her future child will die, Louise still decides to enter into a liaison with the child's prospective father, the knowledge of which he can't forgive her for. According to her husband, in surrendering to the future she'd foreseen, she made the wrong decision and rather should have chosen never to have a child and avoid the suffering and loss that would follow. However, as Zizek, among others, have pointed out, in Arrival's universe, free will consists only in following through on a decision you already know you'll make, rather than attempting to avert the future as if it were the effect of some external will of God. By doing nothing, you're effectively creating, affirming, and enacting chronology. What Louise performs then in her inability to avoid the catastrophe of her daughter's death is what Lacan in the function and field of speech and language in psychoanalysis would call the future anterior. Quote, what is realized in my history is neither the past definite as it was, since it is no more, nor even the perfect as what has been in what I am, but the future anterior as what I will have been, given what I am in the process of becoming, unquote. So, in a sense, what Arrival depicts is the atemporality of the death drive. And let's recall that in contrast to Freud, for Lacan, the death drive is not the ineluctable urge of the organic to return to an inorganic state, nor the thirst for self-destruction, even if destruction and death of the organic body is a side effect. But rather the death drive is an insistence on a form of undeadness, an immortal life, a will to enjoy despite the catastrophe it might cause. The death drive, instead of pursuing an ultimate goal, merely circles incessantly around an intractable object. So return to the thinking of the Santi or the Trisolarans, a key moment in the series revealing the mental shortcomings of the Santi is when the earthly correspondent, Mike Evans, the son of the CEO of the world's largest oil company and a radical environmentalist, who is the partner of UNG, is seen communicating with a Santi liaison via his transmitter device. He tells the story of Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf, presumably an implicit reference to dark forest theory, at which point the Santi becomes confused with the factuality of the information. Evan tries to explain the concept of fiction, but the Santi cannot understand the difference between analogy and deception, and deems that humans must be, by nature, liars. At which point they decide that humans definitively can't be trusted and must cut off all communication with them. So again, it seems there is a fallacy here regarding the most fundamental capacity to communicate, i.e. the capacity for abstraction. It's literally impossible to be in language and not be able to lie. That you can be ethically opposed to it is a different question, but that you can engage in this symbolic without the possibility of cipher or deception is just logically impossible. This points to our author's apparently naive conception of what it is to have a mind capable of abstraction, and indeed what's involved in the communication between two minds, an exchange between two discrete consciousnesses and two unconsciousnesses that by definition is never pure, complete and total, but which always leaves an impossible remainder that inevitably occurs with the exchange of symbols, whether spoken or written. Symbols that attempt to represent something that they themselves can never capture. And this is Lacanian psychoanalytic theory 101. Truth has the structure of a fiction. So the Santi can't lie and they can't read minds. Effectively, they have no unconscious, or otherwise put, they have no theory of mind whatsoever. In strictly Lacanian terms, we're dealing here with the absolute ground zero of being in the symbolic, process of negation. Crudely speaking, the fundamental step whereby a speaking subject allows a signifier to represent them for another signifier. When a baby's first screams become repeatable, replicable, and legible sounds, the immediate connection of the sign to a bodily utterance is lost, and the word becomes the murder of the thing. What form that negation ultimately takes is, of course, either, in Lacanian terms, repression, disavowal, or foreclosure. And these three forms in turn corresponding to neurosis, perversion, and psychosis, respectively. So if the Trisolarians have no ability to understand metaphor or interpret symbols as anything other than a direct correspondent to an immediately observable object, in other words, a sign, not a symbol, or a scream, not a word, then they're either animals or they are full-blown psychotic or highly autistic. And without wishing to pathologize or denigrate any of these categories, it just doesn't seem to be consistent with the rest of the cosmic psychosociology of the author's otherwise tightly woven and expansive universe. For example, how could the dark forest theory hold if not because the Trisolarians have the capacity for deceit? The very premise of the theory is that since they can't truly know the mind of the other, they must keep their intentions similarly hidden, which suggests that they must at least have a fundamental fantasy. That's to say, an inner framework for making the world intelligible to themselves. Or put another way, they must have some sort of libidinal economy which motivates them. And on what grounds do they desire to dominate humans other than as a mode of survival? There must be some quantum of jouissance that is produced in this aim. Furthermore, this problem with the capacity for abstraction leads us to the very kernel of technics itself. Since the Santi are a race of beings whose technological advancement is so beyond that of humans, we must remind ourselves what the origins of technics actually are. As Lacan remarked, our first forays into externalizing memory through language were the striking out of marks on the cave wall to indicate a kill, which he likens to notches on the bedpost, indicating its intimate relationship to the sexual non-rapport, and following which our entrance into the symbolic proper when we begin to bury the dead. After all, what is a gravestone but an attempt to eternalize and metaphorize the ephemeral, disposable, and biodegradable mortal body? What for Roland Barthes was the function of the two-dimensional image of the photograph. In fact, like the gravestone, it mortifies the living body, entering us into a flat death. And this flat death becomes a three-dimensional death when taken into the realms of advanced technology such as virtual reality, which invoke the participation of the living with the dead in this liminal state between life and death. And going further, for Bernard Stiegler, technics and hominization are one in the same process. The capacity for outsourcing the memotechnologies of the biological body begins with the first attempts for an organism to deal with its environment efficiently. For example, the relationship between erect posture and brain development of early primates, which has as much to do with the function of the feet as with the size of the cranium. And going even further, we could return to the evolutionary period of the Cambrian explosion, about 541 million years ago, when the emergence of the face appeared on primitive creatures as a forward-facing arrangement of features. And this evolutionary adaptation that collected sensory organs at the front end of animals being conducive to their survival. This is the moment in the terraforming where the organism becomes decisively subjectified. Terraforming, a term which originally refers to the hypothetical process of deliberately modifying the atmosphere, temperature, surface topography, or ecology of the planet, moon, or other body to be similar to the environment of Earth to make it habitable for humans to live on, unquote. But more specifically, the process of intelligence transforming its surroundings at the scale of the planet. So then we may ask, is the face itself not just a means of communication, but a mode of deception, a shield, a mask, or better still, a vanishing mediator between the individual organism and the rest of the undifferentiated mass of pure, organic, bare life? Does the Santi have a face? Interestingly, we never see an image of the Santi in the series, and the AI representations of them in the virtual reality headsets are all humanoid. The avatar character in the game explains that the Trisolarians have made the image palatable for the human gaze, which leads us to ask, what does that mean? Perhaps it's not palatability, but perceptibility or legibility that's at stake. Can humans conceive of anything being akin to consciousness that doesn't take the form of a body, and furthermore as discrete individual bodies who are part of a unified species being? What if the Trisolarians are nothing like that at all? What is exceedingly strange, though, is that this species claims not to understand fiction, yet has developed this AI technology which simulates the successive annihilation of their whole civilization using avatars that look nothing like them. It seems then it's precisely their intimate relationship with death that makes them such adept technologists and indeed abstractionists. We must assume then that they are the liars when they say they can't lie. However, this is a reflection on the rendering that appears in the Netflix adaptation, and needless to say, the book is far more intricate in its explanation for why the Trisolarians can't lie. They have a system of communication which is completely transparent to each other. They have no private thoughts, which begs the question how language developed at all, if there was no need to make their thoughts urgently known. And so do they speak? It also complicates the matter of how the communication began between humans and Trisolarians. Supposedly it was because a traitor of the Trisolarians named the Listener decided he wanted to warn humanity against cooperation with them as he knew their intentions were not good. When asked by the Princeps, who's the leader of the Santi, why he betrayed them, he explains that it was so his own life would not be wasted. He was too old and too low status to mate, and Trisolaris offered nothing to those on the lower echelons of civilization, but at least by warning Earth, he could give them a chance at survival. The Listener tells his leader, I'm tired of Trisolaris. We've nothing in our lives and spirit apart from survival. Everything is devoted to survival. To permit the survival of the civilization as a whole, there is almost no respect for the individual. Someone who can no longer work is put to death. Trisolarian society exists under a state of extreme authoritarianism. The law has only two outcomes. The guilty are put to death and the not guilty are released. For me, the most intolerable aspects are the spiritual monotony and desiccation. Anything that can lead to spiritual weakness is declared evil. We have no literature, no art, no pursuit of beauty, no enjoyment. We cannot even speak of love. Princeps, is there meaning to such a life? Unquote. The Princeps replies that there were indeed previous civilizations that had such things, and they were the weakest of them all. Essentially, survival and existence proves more important than life and culture on Trisolaris. They exist only to serve the structure of the hierarchy. Individual life and dignity holds no value. Only the system matters. So in a sense, the form of cognition that the Trisolarians has developed is analogous to a collective intelligence, given that all of their communication manifests in a direct correspondence between thought and experience. And expression. It's not only highly efficient, but it's more akin to computational intelligence, instrumental, algorithmic, or indeed the communication between tiny organisms like ants, who can be thought of as colonies of databanks. In this way, the author's imaginary of the Trisolarian civilization shares much with the structure of AI as we experience it today, in its amorphous, omniscient, yet non-conscious nature. It's no surprise, then, that in a spin-off novel, The Redemption of Time by a different author, Bao, the Trisolarians are finally described physically, and they indeed are microscopic creatures, no bigger than a grain of rice or a microchip, and they resemble water bears, whose minuscule scale and intricate group communication systems have made them both extremely vulnerable to humans on an individual physical level, but yet exceedingly powerful as a whole population. So it's usually that the human inability to envisage forms of life different to our own that prevents any real investigation of what contact with other civilizations might actually look like. In Lacanian terms, we are doomed to forever imaginarize the appearance of the other in terms of what we understand, such that we find structure alone hard to perceive. And this was ultimately the lesson of Lacan's mathemes and his later topological project of the synthome, the attempt to strip human thinking of its associations with the image in favor of a clearer apprehension of the topology that underpins our thinking. Excuse me. In this way, his structuralism is extremely helpful in order to comprehend forms of knowledge, whether artificial or non-human, that fall outside of what we commonly understand as intelligence. So, although the series poses serious and fascinating questions about our relationship to the cosmos and our potential encounter with other forms of intelligence, ultimately what the world of the three-body problem most focuses on is the notion of conquest and domination. Who can be the fastest, strongest, and most advanced, at the expense of asking how it changes our place in the universe to know that we're not alone. And importantly, what are the Santi actually like? How do they experience their world? What is their existence for? It's remarkable that in the TV series, at least, we have no inkling of their life world, bodily appearance, ethical systems, or character, other than this childlike wonder that they have at the possibility for a story to be untrue. But how do they experience themselves as temporal beings, given that they communicate with humans via technology that will suggest that their notions of time and space are very different to ours? Notably, the members of the Earth Trisolis organization who we meet are sort of cultish figures, whose conception of the arrival of the Santi is akin to the coming of the Messiah. Rather than a genuine communication with another life form, the interaction becomes a form of worship on the part of the humans, who view the Santi as their only salvation from the ravages of life on Earth. It's not clear, however, what form of life would be adopted once the Trisolarians reach Earth in the predicted 400 years' time, but much like eschatological thinking in general, there can be no clear vision of the time after the rapture, only an invitation to stop thinking altogether. So what can be said of the systems of enjoyment of Earth and Trisolaris, respectively? Each civilization has its particular conceptions of what constitutes a worthwhile existence. Earths are supposedly heterogeneous, whilst apparently for the Trisolarians there is only one form of life worth living, and that is one which serves the system as a whole. So it's tempting to make this sort of obvious analogy with a glorified neoliberalism versus a strawmanned communism. But in reality, both civilizations seem to have similar ideologies at play in their battle for survival, one which fits very well with the TESCREAL bundle, an absolute belief in the value of advanced technologies as the key to prosperity and superiority as a species. And whilst this dialectic may bounce up and down between notions of individual freedom and happiness versus the greater good, ultimately they're headed in the same direction, and that's towards a type of idiot, jouissance, what we could also call instrumental masculinity. To return to Lacan's classic yet to be answered question, what is a science that would include psychoanalysis? We could add, what is a politics that would include psychoanalysis? It would surely be one which derails the relationship of politics to the military-industrial complex, one which, instead of resorting always in the last instance to the dark forest theory of perpetual suspicion and aggression, would acknowledge the joint and inevitable suffering and enjoyment of both parties. And this would be to frame things in the partai political paradigm, partai from Latin to suffer, and indeed the topic of my next book, which this paper is a chapter from. So partai politics whose mode of enjoyment is neither fascist, late capitalism, nor totalitarian state socialism, but rather a new universalism. And I'll finish there.
I just want to say this was really, really brilliant. I can't formulate my question, but I have many thoughts and it's very timely for me. And I just thank you very much, Isabel. It's really good.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
There's a question from Daniel that I will read aloud. Can the unpredictability of the climate on the planet of the Trisolarans be seen as an analogy to the unpredictability of change in international politics?
Well, yeah. I think that's very much the sort of aim of the author, and indeed the Netflix series, that it's that they err towards focusing on sort of our current predicaments and our sort of very chaotic situation that we find ourselves in at the moment, which is in a sense unpredictable, but in another way it's almost quite predictable. I mean, I'm just talking about contemporary politics at the moment. That is, it seems to be sort of random and strange, but actually what we see is repetitions of lots of very, very familiar human behavior that we've seen over and over again, unfortunately. Yeah.
Could you speak a little about the logical time essay that you suggested and how that works into your reading of the three-body problem?
Mm-hmm. Can I talk a bit about that? Did you say? Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. What this paper sort of alludes to and touches on is really this sort of temporal relationship to language that Lacan was so fascinated by, and really sets him apart, or sets psychoanalysis apart, I guess, as a theory of communication as distinct from many more normative ideas of how human beings exchange messages. And the key to this is essentially this weird relationship to time and retroactivity, so that to use the examples of, for example, talking about the film Arrival, even though it's a sort of extreme example to think about a species who essentially don't have a linear experience of time, and that therefore makes us have to reevaluate our own approach to our lives. I mean, that works on sort of several levels, because of course you can understand it in a sort of quite quotidian way as a sort of wake up and smell the coffee, appreciate your life, appreciate the finiteness of your existence. But more philosophically, more interestingly, I think, is the way that it exposes the question of structure when it comes to language, in the sense that there's this weird process that happens at the beginning of language that involves this sort of negativity, which is at the sort of root of the Lacanian sort of Hegelian understanding of the subject in its objective status, so that you always have to have this moment of abstraction, which begins the process of language, which kind of entails this sort of lost time, kind of time that can't be accounted for because it's a retroactive thing that only comes into being once it's set in motion. And I mean, it's a bit sort of long-winded for me to go into here, but I think that the temporal aspect of this film, the Arrival, the film, but also the series, the Three-Body Problem, is interesting to me because it's that aspect of it that isn't there. It's not explicit in the show, but it underpins so much of how we're supposedly relating to this distant species, because this whole idea that these are a species of creatures who are similar to us, they're similar enough to be able to live on our planet, to be able to communicate with us, yet they don't have any way of understanding abstraction. They don't know how to lie, or they don't know how to read minds. And this sort of jump, this conceptual jump that they make in order to sort of build the rest of the premise of the show, hides so much and yet exposes so much that I find really interesting, that allows us to think about, well, what kind of communication can you have when you have complete transparency, which is what sort of computer intelligence aims for, the complete transparency and exchange with no loss of meaning. So that, you know, this is always sort of my bugbear in critiquing most conceptions of artificial intelligence, because it doesn't acknowledge this kind of loss that always occurs between two interlocutors.
Yeah, I guess. Sorry, I also have sort of multiple questions as well. So I guess the first one is, what role do you think memory plays in the context of Trissolarian communication, especially given that the author constructs a sort of semi or linear path of universal technological development for both humans and Trissolarians, which is sort of like suggesting and buying into an underlying material structural understanding of the universe. And then second, I guess, if you could speak a little bit more on the relation of quantum jouissance to Trissolarians. Yeah.
Thank you. They're very hard questions. I don't know if I can answer them, but very good question. I mean, the idea of memory, yeah, it's very mind-boggling actually, because the problem with memory, if you don't have language in the way that we understand language, is it's very hard to understand, to imagine what type of memory systems that they use, because supposedly if there is no urgency to speak, because everybody knows what the other person is thinking, that would change completely the whole process of outsourcing parts of your thinking into other sort of non-organic objects. I mean, if we think about how language begins, or how technology begins, it begins with trying to put something ephemeral into something material, so that it becomes tangible and doesn't perish. But the paradox there is, of course, the material is perishable and the non-material is non-perishable. But so this process of sort of what Stiegler would call sort of grammatization, the sort of way of making your thoughts into something that is part of the universe around you, it's hard to imagine how the Trisolarians do that. And that's why it's interesting that they are depicted by this other author as extremely small, microscopic creatures who, in a sense, probably have a more collective intelligence, that they don't have the sort of interior world that we have as big lumpy human bodies, and that actually with the sort of idea of them as tiny microchips, they're more like a data bank, and therefore in a sense, the Trisolarans become more like our fantasy of AI. They are sort of algorithmic. They are a sort of general intelligence that works towards a sort of distinct goal, and just, you know, goes for this one objective, basically. So yeah, that's a hard question, but I'm hoping that's sort of edging towards what you're asking. Another question, remind me of the question, sorry.
Oh yeah, the relation of quantum jouissance to the Trasolarian civilization. Yeah, I actually also have a third question, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this is the question. What type of enjoyment? What is the sort of is the lost element that they are expending with their interaction with us? If we think about it in a sort of Bataillean sense, you know, we are talking about this distant civilization, and so therefore we're talking about the economic exchange of a total economy, a sort of cosmic economy. And you know, for obviously for Bataille, he was always comparing between the sort of limited economy of the earth and the general economy of the cosmos, i.e. that it, rather than the idea that we have this limited collection of resources that capitalism defines as always a sort of deficit that we always need to try and scrabble around to try and get our share of. That's actually not how energy works. In fact, we have too much. There's too much, and so because there's too much, we always have to try and expend it and get rid of it because we don't know what to do with it. And so in the general economy of Bataille, this metaphorized in the question of the sun. So it's quite interesting to think about a planet that has so many suns, and they have this excess of expendable energy, how they then try and interact with us who only have one sun. But the idea that they want something from us, when they sort of seem to be so much more advanced, yet there's something from us that they want. So they want something less than they have, in a sense. So I think it's quite interesting to try and see their project as one of jouissance, in a sense. There's something that they want. There's something that they're trying to gain, but we don't quite understand what they're chasing, as it were.
Did you want to ask your third question, Devin?
Yeah, so I guess I'm wondering, I guess, yeah, what the role of paradox in the author's sort of depiction of the Trisolarians, or of like within the general series, because I feel like there's always a sort of tension between different like sort of duels in the overall series. So yeah, I was I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
The role of paradox in his, I mean, my disclaimer is that I haven't read the whole series of his trilogy, and I might be very, very much maligning him in my interpretation of the series. But as I say, you know, I think the Netflix series is probably quite a bastardization of his writing. Although I have heard that he's criticized quite heavily along the same lines in it from a sort of, as I say, you know, the sort of political theory context, in that there is some sort of quite masculinist and ideological themes going on in the books that belie a sort of disinterest in some of these more sort of theoretical questions to do with, you know, the paradox of who these people are and who this other species is. And I think that, you know, it's interesting that another author had to take on the task of depicting who these creatures were, because the author never did, and that's quite significant. I think that was never the interest of the book. Yeah.
Thank you. Laura, if you'd like to speak, you may, or I can read this comment.
I would be grateful if you could read it, please, Maure.
Sure. Would you like for me to read all of it, or just the question?
Maybe all of it makes more sense, I think.
Sure. The comment is, I have a lot of questions yet to form, but I have something to ask. I am spending time for years now with Lacan in many ways. One, I would like to hear anything you can offer in relation to your talk today on Lacan's theory on point de capiton. I'm interested in this in its way of thinking of memory, thought, and language with time in a nonlinear way. I'm trying to work with it in a multidimensional thinking of space and the unconscious and all the slippage that brings. Retroactive means gets sewn in without.
Right. Am I muted? Oh, I don't think I am. You can hear me. So yeah, the point de capiton. I mean, the quilting point. In English, if anyone is unfamiliar with that term, I mean, it depends, because whether you're talking about the sort of clinical question of point de capiton, or the more sort of abstract, and I'm assuming you're talking about the more philosophical understanding of it. But clinically, this is supposedly a moment around which meaning gets coalesced and formed and brings together a certain system that can then be said to form a coherent world for a subject, and that we have to have those, and we have to have that in order to be able to make our world intelligible. But the question of how it works in the non-linear way, or when we're trying to think about how to compare, for example, how that functions in human language as opposed to Trisolarian language, or how it goes to other forms of thinking, it is interesting because it does really problematize this idea. And Lacan didn't have the answers to everything and for all time, and I don't think that necessarily we can try and superimpose this idea onto sort of speculative ideas of other forms of language. But I think it's, again, one of those concepts that sort of tries to show how the retroactivity of language allows us to bring meaning into our language. So, for example, point de capiton also can refer to the way that you only start to understand something at a certain point when somebody's talking, and then you retroactively add up the things that you've already heard in order to make something make sense. So you might think that you're listening to something and you're understanding it, but actually you only understand it 3 sentences in, and then your mind will have recaptured the things that you already heard in order to make sense of the things that are coming before you. And in the same way, we can think about music and memory, and how you listen to a melody, and because you've heard the melody several times before, you know what's coming, but also because a certain note allows you to hear the previous notes in a different way. So this all illustrates the fact that when you're hearing and comprehending and perceiving language or symbols, there is a sort of process going on that is playing with our ideas of time, because it's not just like, oh, here's one word, here's the next word, here's the next word. So a unit of meaning, for example, is the smallest unit of meaning could be a sentence. It might not be a word. It has to be, you have to try and figure out at what point there is a point de capiton, so that you can grab hold of something and then enter into the process of perception. And of course, that is very different whether we're talking about spoken language or effective communication, or indeed music, or indeed images, because they work in very many different ways. So it's a very interesting question, of course, yeah, when you're trying to think about it in relation to different modes of communication, different forms of intelligences. Sorry, I hope that's in some way useful.
It's really useful. I was thinking a lot about how you can only have that experience because you have a body. You know, so you live experience, and then something might shift and change, and then that whole slippy thing that memory does, and you know, move stuff around and translates it, but it doesn't really change it, right? In a kind of mathematical understanding. So maybe I haven't watched this series. I am very familiar with Arrival, and I'm trying to refer to that in my writing. So I'm super excited about what you said today. But I wonder if it is that the absence of a body for anything in AI is going to be so problematic, and it's such a flawed exercise in the beginning, from that whole beginning to what it's become, and this kind of bounding of space according to a body that's always, like, in a way, bodies are always dying, but they're always bodies that look like the previous bodies. And I think there's something kind of curious about that in terms of point decapiton. I can't really work it out, but it's like something about a hyperspace kind of collective unconscious, maybe, or something like that. So maybe this kind of sped upness has brought them to this massive suffering of this, like, maybe they are kind of a body without being a physical body in the human. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, it's super cool. Thank you. Sorry, I'm rambling. Bye.
No, not at all. Thank you. That's really interesting, and absolutely, yeah, on the nose, because the point about having a body is that it creates all of these other forms of failure that make communication possible, and the sort of the contrast between having the idea of the singular body, which also fits into the species body of the humans, and that there's this sort of tandem going on between the singular enclosed form of human perception and communication versus the supposedly collective and cultural form of communication, which for the Trisolarans is problematized, because we supposedly don't really think that they have the singular form of communication at all, if they are all communicating by this sort of collective intelligence, or sort of insect intelligence, sort of data bank intelligence. And yet the sort of failure of the body when it comes to the possibility to comprehend symbols at all, to comprehend sounds. And sound is a very interesting question for psychoanalysis as well, because it exists in this sort of strange space between materiality and non-materiality, because it, as we know from people who experience audio hallucinations, then hearing voices that aren't actually there, but they are produced by the brain, you know. So the question of the sort of object, the sonic object, is one that really brings up this problem with how the body interprets noises, interprets language, and interprets meaning in a temporal fashion. So yeah, that's a very interesting thing that you brought up. Thank you.
Yeah, I found it. So I guess the question is, from a Lacanian perspective, how does the rise of AI and other non-human intelligences challenge or reaffirm the human subject's relationship to the real, imaginary, and symbolic?
Yeah, the golden question. I mean, I think that's a question that I've been babbling on about for quite a few years now, and I don't have a very short, simple answer to it, but it's really, really interesting, and one of I think the core questions about how how AI makes us have to reflect on our relationship to these dimensions in Lacanian in a Lacanian sense. But of course, it's not just jargon. It's not just jargon that we say, oh, and how do we relate to the real, imaginary, symbolic, and have a sort of exclusive conversation in Lacanese? Because actually, what's so interesting about when you start to understand what the stakes are of those dimensions, the real, imaginary, and symbolic, which of course are, difficult terms, and they're not immediately understandable to everybody, and perhaps not everybody in here does Lacan or understands Lacan or whatever, but they're ideas which, once you've kind of got your head around them, allows us to really start to try and distinguish different parts of the human experience and different parts of what it is to have a body, to be in language, to experience ourselves in reality. And so without going into a sort of full-on lecture on the real, imaginary, and symbolic, I think that, of course, to take it in reverse order, the symbolic is what we understand as the laws and sort of formalizable dimensions to human interaction, and the things that are kind of what allows us to be able to even talk about AI as a form of intelligence, in that it's a replicable a form of abstraction that we've had since the beginning of time, that have become progressively more complex, and has allowed us to create such immense and complex forms of communication that we have then been able to outsource into non-human forms of communication. And then, of course, the imaginary is the whole world that deals with the question of not just the image, there's that the actual visual image, but also the process of being able to imaginarize our world, and that's of course a visual question, but it's also has to do with the question of the inner life, the ability to reflect and have a sort of form of perception, a sort of cognitive mapping, if you like, of how to imagine what's out there in the world. And of course, we know that blind people also have that. So it's not just a visual question, it's to do with being able to structure and understand the world according to the sort of internal structures of the imaginary. And then you have the real, which is sort of the most complicated part of Lacan, because it doesn't really refer to reality. It refers to this bit of reality that we can't quite grasp, and that exists precisely because the imaginary and the symbolic don't capture all that is what it is to be a human being in a body that has to sort of try and make itself legible and consistent, but yet it also has to deal with the fact that there is something that's not quite complete, and this real you can interpret in many different ways, and it has been interpreted in many different ways. But I think the way that I always like to come back to it is, again, sort of one to do with temporality and one to do with speech, and to do with the fact that our speech can never really capture what it is to have a body, and what it is to try and communicate the things that we don't have. And I always go back to the question of the baby and the scream, and the fact that you are suddenly confronted as a human creature into a world where you're torn from being sort of what you think is a whole into being a partial being, whose sort of screams have to become language, but they can never quite sort of tame this initial whole that you sort of phantasmatically think that you have. And again, there are many other definitions of the real, to do with sexuality, to do with the strangeness of the fact that we have a body, and yet our bodies only become bodies by the fact that they become symbolized or become legible through the gaze of the other the other and other people and the world at large. And all of these factors are, of course, challenged by the rise of AI and other forms of intelligence, and they're challenged by it, but also, more to the point, we're challenged to understand how that works for us as we come closer to trying to find other forms of intelligence that we think might be similar to our own. So yeah, that's just scratching on the surface, but it's a very good question.
I mean, like,
Thank you so
my
much.
question, yeah, if it is, my question is like regarding to like the pre-symbolic or like kind of the after symbolic, or the, let's say, the later work of Lacan, you know, the fact that we cannot count into to three, we can only count to 1, 2. Could it be that this like three solar bodies as they are, you know, introduce that kind of like chaotic type of thing where the real is already integrated? So we could say that those creatures didn't actually suffer the, you know, the entering into the symbolic itself. And maybe when we approach the idea of AI, or like, you know, fantasized AI as it is here, could it be that it could be that kind of, I don't know, thing an sich, or like this kind of super chaotic type of non-castrated, let's say, before entering into language type of, I'll say, civilization or writing or so on, that basically kind of represents what will kind of non-castrated into the real itself, I'll say, civilization look like. I don't know if, because as I heard, there's like the point where the subject enters into language and something is lost. That becomes the real. Could it be that this itself, this kind of non-linear language and so on, be that kind of real type of, you know? And I'm thinking also about the, I'll say, interpretation of, I'll say, Joyce that Lacan had in his later seminars, how he tried to count it to 3, to do those like kind of, I don't know, I'll say the threads and so on.
Or I mean, not, yeah.
Basically.
That's really interesting. Yes, and yeah, 'cause I think in the paper, I think what I was sort of hinting at is as well, like, that he paints those the Santi as, I mean, structurally speaking, as either animals or psychotics or autists. I mean, serious autists, not, you know, in the sense that they don't have an unconscious, so they don't have any ability to cipher anything. Everything's on the surface. There's no possibility of metaphorizing anything, which is, of course, what supposedly is what full psychosis is based upon, the fact that you don't know how to substitute one signifier for another, so everything becomes a sort of linear succession of meaning. And yes, much of the sort of way that the Trisolarans, the Santi, are depicted, if we're to be sort of anal about it and try and understand how, what would their sort of structure be, it sounds very much like they are not in the symbolic, in a sense. They have this sort of form of communication which is uncastrated, is completely not submitted to any sort of limits. But then that begs the question: why are they even talking to us at all? And what is it about them that initiates this need to come and talk to us? So there's a lot that doesn't add up. But again, you know, it's sci-fi. It doesn't have to make sense. But that's why I think it's interesting to read them alongside something like Arrival and the heptapods, because at least with the heptapods, we get an idea of, okay, what sort of communication do they have, and you know, linguistically it's much more interesting because you can see that there is this actual topological representation of how they communicate, which actually is quite nice to read with the sort of later Lacan, in the terms of the binding of the Santhome, and how they sort of represent this form of communication which is totally topological, which doesn't rely on our ideas of the imaginary and symbolic exchange in traditional sense, so that we can sort of get this inkling of the sort of sheer barren existence of what would it be like to have a form of communication which is before any of the symbolic hits in, and it's an impossible position that we can't really understand, but through sort of sci-fi we can kind of glimpse at what it might be to experience something like that. Yeah, so which is why I like Arrival more than the Three-Body Problem, because you actually get a little bit of an inkling of what that might be.
I have a small continuation here, and I'm thinking about two kind of arguments of Zizek initially, which said that about this neural link that sexuality itself would fail once this, like, kind of unconstrained sort of I can read their thoughts type of issue will happen. And I'm also thinking of a thesis of, I heard this somewhere, of Todd McGowan, which said that basically the coronavirus, the whole thing about it, actually stopped capital for a bit. In some way, so because he talked about the biopolitics guys couldn't fathom this thing and so on, so maybe if even turn it around Bataille, I guess, around Nickland, wouldn't this mean that itself, this kind of capitalist, non-sexualized anything, just reproducing itself, could just, I would say, have this kind of, I don't know, non-escapeness for the subject itself? Like the subject couldn't even, like, I'll say, perceive itself into a republic where human rights or like any sort of rights would be. Like, I'm thinking about how you said about that guy who was like, oh, I'm saying, so I'm just gonna die. So this kind of like in itself, the real being some sort of, I don't know, capital itself that can just be integrated and worked and worked and worked and worked in this way.
Well,
sexual relationship being some sort of, I don't know, social bond that might just help us in this regard.
Well, I think that the Santi probably, it would be wrong to think that they could have sex. I don't think that they can. I mean, even though that must be a contradiction in the book, because if they've got no language, they've got no sex, really. I mean, that there's no non-rapport, there is no symbolic, there is no sort of form of exchange in that way. So that's why, there's a sort of sleight of hand, really, with these characters. They're just sort of made to fit any kind of problem that we have, and they're not a coherent species at all. But yeah, sorry, and then your second thing was about Todd McGowan, about the
basically he said that the fact that biopolitics couldn't fathom the fact that coronavirus and the whole pandemic type it's kind of stopped the capital.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of how this kind of, I say, uncastrated, can, I'll say, jouissance can be gotten into capital itself and can make the capital itself more stronger in some way. Like the same with Neuralink, with how could maybe, I would say, could it be that our own defense towards capital itself might be sexuality, might be language, and so on. And once this get unconstrained, then it could be just pure chaotic capital, wolf on wolf thing.
Yeah.
Like turn to Hobbesian nature, whatever.
Yeah, but I don't think that coronavirus did stop capital. I mean, maybe it did for a second, but I think that it very quickly learned how to incorporate it into the system. So I think you'd need something a lot more drastic to completely forget, to think that something like coronavirus could stop capitalism. I mean, nothing stops capitalism in our current configuration. So yeah, but I mean, again, Todd McGowan has a particular approach to biopolitics because he hates biopolitics. And I have a lot of sympathy with some of his critiques, because I think with biopolitics you don't get the dimension of the sort of the undead human body. You only get the sort of supposedly biological body that's being worked upon by economic forces, but you don't get the sort of fully complicit body of the Lacanian subject, which is all too happy to be caught up in the process itself because of sexuality, because of the non-rapport, and the fact that we are ineluctably part of capitalism ourselves by sheer virtue of the fact that we are in language. Yeah.
I'm just going to read the question. The absence of the lost element in the Trisolaran makeup seems to be emphasized by the structure of the teardrop ship, which is absolute in its formation, with no gaps between atomic nuclei, and which has absolute reflectivity, and therefore is effectively invincible, which allows it to decimate the entire fleet of human spaceships. I wonder if this acts as a sort of fetishized absence of an unconscious writ large by Lucien, which literalizes the real and smooths out all quilting points by filling in the material gaps at the level of quanta, disallowing any retroactive ritornello and replacing it with a sheer repetition of absolute recall.
Lovely. Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that's a very nice way of expressing it, of understanding it. And yeah, I mean, there's so much to read into the sort of symbolization and that he uses that I think doesn't translate fully in the Netflix series, because it's sort of brought down to, of course, the sort of banality of having to be a Americanized TV show. But yet there is all of these very interesting imageries and ideas that bring these questions to light. I think that's a very nice way of thinking about it. And again, you know, it's this sort of trying to visualize an impossibility, trying to put into a coherent form something that is not possible to understand, like de la Mela, you know, like Lacan's way of trying to understand what escapes from the human body at the moment of birth. This supposed pure potentiality of total enclosed absolute objects, like you mentioned, with a sort of absolute reflectivity and the sort of boundedness that doesn't allow for any entrances, doesn't allow for any gaps or lapses or imperfections. And I think that's a good way to understand it, of him trying to kind of imagine the Trisolarians as this perfect object. Again, as Bogdan mentioned, you know, these creatures who exist in the real, they haven't actually entered into the symbolic. So they're a sort of fantasy for us more than anything else. You know, we want them more than they want us. So perhaps the reason we never see them is because they're our imaginary thing that we're holding on to. They don't really exist, but we want them to exist because they represent something for us which is absolutely desirable and impossible.
Okay, thank you so much for that response. That was amazing. I guess also I'll just say like the sophon as well. The sophon is like, the way that I see that is it's kind of like a fetishized prelapsarian object.
Yeah.
Because I mean it's a fictional proton-sized supercomputer that basically the Trisolarians send in advance of their arriving. And it's supposed to sort of wreak havoc on any kind of scientific progress for the humans, which in a way effectively operates as like almost like this, were it not the case that this would happen, then allegedly we would be able to complete the scientific enterprise or something like this, which I think it kind of assumes like a Heisenberg universe as opposed to like a Schrodinger, which has this notion of there being a discrete object as opposed to like the wavelength being fundamental. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting. And the sophon exactly is this another fantasy object that's sort of held out as this wondrous thing that's sort of allowing them to keep their sort of superiority and authority over the humans, whilst we sort of trudgingly try and catch up with their technology before they reach us. So it's quite a sort of mediating object, a sort of fantasy object that allows us again to sort of fantasize about the absolute end of the technology that they possess, that we don't possess, and that imagines a type of universe that can produce such complexity. And again, to sort of contrast it with the fact that the whole premise of the show, at least the TV version, is that they have something like a sophon, yet they can't read human minds. I mean, that just makes no sense whatsoever, because of course it completely sort of messes up the whole sort of scientific episteme that we're supposed to believe that they have, because we can just say, oh yeah, but they've got all this information, this data, but they can't see behind the facade, the sort of secret black box, in this very sort of Freudian way of the hidden meaning behind human communication. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess, sorry, I have a few more questions now as well. But the first here is, could it be possible that the Trissolarian jouissance is always in pure ecstasy, qua Baudrillard, and their sole focus on survival, given the very real material conditions which delimit their conceptions of sociality, because it can literally destroy their society, is more akin to a jouissance of full embodiment without mind?
Mm. Yeah, so they're sort of they're total bodies without minds. Well, it's a sort of, it's a fantasy of feminine jouissance, isn't it? Really, it's a sort of the paradox that you always get between the to use the sort of example of the masculine robot versus the feminine robot, you know, or the feminine body as being all enjoyment and no thought. If you think of the pornographic body, it's all enjoyment, but there's no thought. And then if you think of the sort of ultimate masculine body, it's supposedly all thought and really not supposedly supposed to enjoy, like the ultimate fighting machines, you know, the ultimate robots that can just work and work and work, and they're not going to be sort of interrupted by any of the time wastings of sexuality, which is of course what Baudrillard talked about, and that we always have in our images of masculine robots, you know, whether it's from you know, Star Trek or Terminator, or it's always about them eventually becoming humanized because they found an emotion, or because they found sexuality, or something cracks their the machinic nature of their sort of masculine drive to just carry on, which of course is in contrast to the feminine robot, who is essentially a vehicle of absolute pleasure and absolute jouissance, that only then cracks when they start to understand their condition, and they start to understand how they're compromised by this this absolute materiality of them being just pure body. So yeah, I think that's a interesting thought, that there is just this drive to have a complete separation from the body, and or either a complete separation from the body or a complete absorption into the body, so you just become this total body, like as is I've written about is in the book, William Burroughs' idea of the popling, which is this sort of complete phallic object, which is a total body that just is completely erogenous and in all forms, which is actually quite a scary idea.
Yeah, thank you. Oh yeah, I guess I would have another question. I think you mentioned that you haven't finished reading the series, or you're not familiar with the series, but with, sorry, with the last books. But something you mentioned about Barthes and like the sort of 3D death when they're turning to more advanced technologies, I think is implicit within the author's exploration in the final book of like different dimensions and the way that that sort of interacts. So so yeah, I guess maybe if you could speak a little bit more on the sort of like this flattening or this flat death that occurs when I would say when maybe Trissolarians enter communication with humanity and vice versa.
Yeah, well, I mean, the you mean when they what is the sort of form of death that they enter into when they're communicating with us? Or
Yes, yes, and also I guess the the inverse situation as well, like for the human to be communicating with the Trissolarian, um, what is sort of going on there as well?
yeah. Well, again, this is the sort of strange paradox about the at least the show, is that we don't quite really understand what the basis of their communication is, because it doesn't really seem to make sense. And essentially what we try to do with them is make them into a sort of deity, that they're just an all-knowing presence, and that we either need to listen to everything they say because they're the Messiah who's going to come and save us, or they're a terrible threat, and we need to kind of prevent them from reaching us by all costs. So there is no sort of middle ground of actually entering into a dialogue, or what could be seen as an actual real form of communication with them, because of course we have this problem with they don't understand fiction, they aren't supposedly capable of abstracting, they don't see the difference between a metaphor and a lie. And so you sort of don't really have any form of, you don't sort of have any form of communication at all. And that's why, in a sense, it's the connection between sort of death and metaphor are very apparent. They're quite aligned, and the process of actually putting something into a replicable form is basically death itself. Death has to happen in order for something to become transcendent. It has to pass into a non-material form in order for it to become permanent, which is the paradox that I mentioned earlier, which is the idea that you have to, in order to begin language, you have to bury your dead, because you don't have a system of permanence until the sort of biological body becomes a sort of symbol that has made a mark that then you can repeat, and it becomes iterable, as opposed to sort of singular. And this is the kind of problem, isn't it, of the question of the singularity of the human subject, is that in order for us to be truly human, to be truly unique, to be truly sort of self-contained beings with an interior life, we have to have this sense of the complete singularity of us that cannot be repeated, it cannot be mirrored in any other format. But yet, in order for us to be able to communicate and begin the process of abstraction, something has to be replicable, and something has to be iterable. So death enters into this process, and of course death in the sense of the actual death of the biological body, but death in the sense of the murder of the thing that has to become the word in order for it to become the process of abstraction. And again, going back to the sort of Lacanian example, the scream is is a physical utterance from the body, which has a direct relation to something that's happening in the body at that moment. And as soon as that scream becomes a legible word that you can then repeat, it completely breaks off from the connection to the human body. So it becomes something that's outside, that's inhuman, that then becomes in the abstract. And babies are a very, very easy way to sort of visualize this and understand how that process works. But essentially, death is that process, and it has to happen in order for life to continue. I suppose that's the strange thing about it.
Thank you. There's a comment, there are a couple of comments from Laura. I don't know if you'd like those to be brought into discussion.
I was curious about this device that's been sent ahead of time. I don't know what it's called. That's to stop humans gaining any more intelligence. Have I understood that correctly?
Well, the sophon is this enormous contraption that essentially it's a sort of panopticon in a way that it's a proton-sized supercomputer that is there to monitor and sort of gather all of the data on human beings and collate everything that we do and say, but at the same time try and sort of minimize our technological advancement. So it's sort of, yeah, it's a sort of it's a surveillance system, but it's also a system of gathering data, but data that supposedly doesn't include reading our minds, which is like strange.
Do you think it could be like a form of sterilization then?
Sterilization.
So I was thinking if like with sound, you can play certain sounds and they will cancel one another out, so you can't hear another, or you can kind of have this standing wave where, you know, if one wave is at one end and it's in another, there's a point in between, just slightly off between the two, where there's like a stillness and nothing can really be, but it's kind of there. And I was just thinking, that's something quite weird about if no more data can be gathered or nothing else can be learned or had. It's not death, but it's kind of something that prevents life, maybe, or new form or new meaning. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, it just makes me think about the fact that, you know, it's quite a Nietzschean idea, isn't it? Like that you have to forget stuff. You have to get rid of stuff in order to know new stuff. You can't just exponentially gather more and more knowledge. There always has to be a process of sort of release and extraction, jettisoning things that you don't need in order to be able to understand or perceive or gain more knowledge. So the idea of the sort of sophon as being something that carries on limitlessly, you know, gathering more and more information, seems to be a strange idea, but also sort of maybe a sort of quite Hegelian idea about trying to reach the absolute point of complete understanding, complete knowledge, with no disposal. Yeah.
It's I can't remember who said it. I think it's David Eagleman. Like the memory of other memories is memory.
Yeah.
That's cool. Thank you. I have one last comment, which is just about cyborgs, robots. Whenever they're female, they're always non-threatening. Apart from, well, there's a few that they're different, but an Ex Machina, which is like such a terrible film, but it's kind of all right in its own kind of perverse way, is at least that one has the mind to outwit the man.
Yeah.
You know, there's kind of escape, which is curious.
Yeah,
thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean that film is very prominently featured in my previous book, because I think it's a very important film, even though it's a shit film in many ways. It's a very important film in terms of thinking about structure and femininity and AI and knowledge. So yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yes.
There's another question from Bogdan.
Yeah, I have one more question actually. I don't know if you heard about the guy called Timothy Snyder. He has this idea of postmodern to pre-modern, to new paganism in terms of people worshiping billionaires and so on and so on, you know, how they engage in sacrifice, how they, like the old Vikings, they want to give, I don't know, get things in the grave for the afterlife, and how these new billionaires kind of like want to take the whole world with them to, you know, to death or something, you know. But because it looks to me more like speculative almost, you know, to quote Hegel, than actually the theory of techno-feudalism. I mean, we can all say, okay, techno-feudalism economically, but I think structurally, phantasmatically, maybe the idea of, I'll say, new paganism in the worshipping of billionaires, you have a little bit that the new Leviathans type of issue. I think that is something that it looks interesting to me, more interesting a bit than the techno-feudalism. I don't know if you heard of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's it's interesting and then probably quite accurate that we do worship billionaires. I mean, that has sort of become our new religion, that we clearly are so fascinated by them that we're happy to sort of allow them not just to accrue all the wealth, but to sort of determine our futures, and that they literally are creating our imaginaries of what type of future we should have. And you know, that somebody like Elon Musk, as idiotic as he is, has so much power that we have sort of handed over to him, because we're still all using his platforms and we're still all chuckling along with his, you know, alliance with the far right now. And the fact that he is the person who is still given a sort of veneer of respectability shows that, you know, that there is something that we fetishize very much about people like him, about the wonder boys who are able to kind of take an idea and take it to these sort of heights and become supposedly superhuman. Because there's something about like people like Elon Musk that I think makes us feel like they're superhuman, makes us feel like they have this sort of almost godlike existence, that they're able to sort of bring things out into reality that weren't there previously. And yeah, it's to our detriment, but we always do that, don't we? We have a need to make these people great in order for us to swallow the fact that they are basically ruining the world for the rest of us. But because if we really think about it, we're really to blame as well. You know, we've allowed these people to take up so much space and have so much power that actually we probably could have prevented if we were well organized enough to try and prevent stuff like this. And you know, obviously Elon Musk is the end of this, but the ladder towards it is every part of neoliberalism and managerialism and business and corporate, you know, the corporate world that we have to enter into just to be able to live our daily lives. And it seeps into everything that we do, and it's kind of all kind of fits into this larger system that eventually at the other end of it leads up to people like Elon Musk. So yeah, we definitely worship them, unfortunately.
The idea kind of was that we also give offerings. For example, we invest in their stock somehow, and then when we buy that stock, the funny thing is that we have kind of a jouissance where like you maybe get something, you maybe don't get something, you know, like it's plus minus type of issue. Or like you buy a stock, you maybe win or lose, and that's kind of gets this kind of like sacrificial type of thing, you know, into it. And the interesting idea was that he compared it to Viking funerals, where people were taking their you know commodities with them in the afterlife, and how these people want to basically be as strong as to take the whole world with them. Like there is some sort of battalion death drive which wants to sort of take the whole world, everything, because we know that they cause CO2 emissions, and they want to kind of like get everything else, all this like world we live in, with them, and then after we left with, I don't know, Warhammer stuff or something. But yeah, but yeah. So that is quite interesting in the approach.
Yeah. No, that's that's really interesting. Yeah, because they're gonna go to Mars and, like, set up their amazing colonies and do what, like, what is it that they're gonna have that's gonna be so amazing? Who knows? But I think
stand-up comedians.
Pardon?
Stand-up comedians they will have.
Yeah, AI comedians. I'd love to see them.
I'm sure there's a lot of people who want to kiss some ass over there, but that's to quote Biden, I didn't say that.
Devin, would you like to ask your question? Or Mike, sorry, Mike, would you like to ask your question? Do you have audio?
Oh, yes. I guess I didn't really formulate it in the form of a question, but I just was picking up on earlier. It was mentioned, arrival was mentioned, so I was just trying to sketch like a brief sort of contrast between the different alien forms that are explored in arrival as opposed to the Trisolarians, which is, it seems like it's more body-like, and it utilizes the cephalopod as a kind of model, which I think challenges the usual search for extraterrestrials or anything that's alien, which tends to be in outer space, which I see as a kind of symbol of scientism, in the sense that this is always the hope to find a complete neutral space, or a vacuum, so as to reproduce initial conditions, something like this. So the heptapod seems like a nice challenge to the Trisolarian.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't really have a question, I guess, but I just wanted to just offer that as a contrast. Thank you.
Yeah, that's nice. I mean, yes, as I said, like the sort of form of communication of the heptapods is really much more interesting than, or at least it's more, it's explored more than the Trisolarians explicitly, but by the director, as opposed to us sort of speculating. And the sort of topological nature of their communication is, very sort of amenable to sort of Lacanian analysis, in a sense that it allows us to think about how our language is very much needs to have a topological approach for us to understand truly the sort of structure of how language and time relate to each other. And I like the fact that you point out that it's the fact that they're cephalopods, they're creatures that we actually do understand because we have them, and they are earthly in a sense, sort of bringing up the sort of strangeness of the creatures that already are here that we don't understand. I mean, cephalopods are always these creatures that we're very obsessed with, aren't we? Wanting to have octopus affairs and thinking that they have this other form of emotional intelligence that we don't understand, which is perfectly possible. But we definitely have a sort of affinity or some sort of affection for the cephalopod as a type of hyper intelligent creature that we perhaps haven't properly understood yet. So that's, I mean, I'm sure they chose that for a reason. Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question, please. I know you mentioned earlier the notion of undead and undeadness, and I was hoping you would expand. I don't want a Lacanian lecture, but if you could kind of expand that and maybe link it to the notion of the second death.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the sort of undead, to be brief about it, you know, it's in psychoanalysis, the undead is essentially jouissance, is essentially the death drive is the undead. It's not actually heading for death, but the more sort of scary thing, which is that you can't die. It's the idea that there is no end, and that's also sort of almost more terrifying than the idea of a sort of a finish, an end to suffering, is the idea that, well, actually, what if our bodies die, but the death drive is still there? What if we're still suffering? What if there's something that persists beyond our body that torments and essentially is a sort of nugget of I think psychoanalytic theory itself. Sorry, in the second part of your question, can you just say it again?
Yes, the notion of second death.
The second death, yes. Well, the second death is very important, of course, in Lacan, and it features in primarily Seminar 7, but it's essentially to do with the idea that the second death actually occurs before the first death, i.e. the second death is this idea that once we've entered into language, we have essentially died in the sense that we've entered into the abstract realm that I was mentioning before, that death is death and abstraction come hand in hand, that you can't actually have abstraction, you can't have iteration, you can't have the symbolic unless death begins its march, essentially. And so the second death is this sort of is castration, is the moment that the language hits in and hits into the body, and which always comes before the death of the mortal body, the actual death of the human biological body. And you know, Lacan has several definitions of death that he uses that all kind of allude to different forms of understanding what we mean when we're talking about death. So, you know, he has death in reality, which is just basically human body dying, and then that's it, that's the end of you. But you're not quite dead yet, because other human beings still can imaginarize you and remember you, and you still exist for them. And then you have another form of death, which is a sort of death that occurs if you had a sort of apocalypse where everything, all memories were kind of erased, and the idea of continuing on the symbolic couldn't happen. Of course, this is something that's hard to imagine, because we even though we have apocalypses as horizons, we can't actually live through them by definition. And then the sort of other third death, I suppose, is the sort of object of psychoanalysis, which is to have a subjective destitution, which is to get to a point where everything previous that you were symbolically has gone, and you, even though you are still the same subject structurally, you have kind of destituted everything that was before structural to your existence. And again, a sort of impossible situation, but it's a sort of horizon of psychoanalysis as a clinical practice, is that you supposedly should reach a moment of subjective destitution where your previous fantasies are traversed, etc., etc., etc. But I think that you know, sort of the second death was, of course, very important for Lacan in terms of thinking about sexuality, thinking about suffering, and he famously talked about the libertines in Sade, in his essay Count avec Sade, where his basic argument was that these libertines, who were the Sardian creatures who had to commit the ultimate crime, and they were completely obsessed with, you know, bringing the absolute pinnacle of enjoyment, sexual fulfillment, and suffering into the world, they could never quite achieve it, because they were always kind of like thwarted by their own biological existence, which is that they had a body, they would reach a point where they would have come too much, they couldn't carry on, or the people that they were trying to torture or whatever died. You know, sorry to be horrible, but structurally speaking, this was a very important idea because it was a way that Lacan kind of tried to think about how this sort of process of trying to reach an absolute is always thwarted by the question of castration. Is that essentially you can't get to this ultimate moment because the second death has already happened before you can reach the first death, the sort of fantasized death of the Sardian torturer who wants to get to this ultimate moment, but they actually can't because it's always already happened before they've even started. So yeah, so that's the sort of second death in a nutshell.
Maure has had to leave and we're coming up to 8 o'clock. Isabel, are you okay for one final question, which we have in?
Sure.
Brilliant. Devon, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. So I was coming back to, I think, an earlier point about, I think you discussed how like the Trisolarians not being depicted as a form of like this fantasy of either the total body or some like abstracted mind. So I guess I wonder whether that can be read as a sort of critique of intelligibility and as sort of undermining the dark forest, which might make a little bit more sense in the context of the last book called Death's End. So yeah, I guess there's like spoilers, but I can go into some of the context if you'd like.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, yeah, so I do think that his like portrayal of these masculine and feminine elements is problematic. But the end of the book, Death's End, we have the feminine character Chen Xin, who chooses this more sort of quote unquote feminine route at the expense of human civilization, essentially allowing Earth to be invaded by the Trisolarians and not broadcasting the location of the Trisolarians. And so even though the Trisolarians do have their location exposed actually by a masculine sort of element of human civilization that's like on board a military ship, and they're sort of away from Earth. I wonder whether this ending here, where Chen Xin ultimately goes with the Trisolarians and their Sophon into like sort of a place outside of time, which is like this sort of like weird like dimension that, so there's like higher levels of dimensionality, and essentially they go into a dimension that is external to the 3D reality, and witness the sort of like heat death of the universe, but then return everything back to, because it sits outside of time, and there's this whole like complex cosmodynamics or physics that's going on there. But yeah, essentially I wonder whether it can be read as a sort of undermining of this dark forest tenant. Yeah.
Yeah, I really want to read all of the books because it sounds that that definitely gets much more interesting. and I wonder, because you know the Netflix version has sort of you know bastardized lots of elements of the book that if they are going to have if they are going to have more, and whether they do justice to these ideas. I like the idea that this ultimate kind of capitulation to the feminine, where you know it seems like this is a very sort of masculine phallic narrative, but actually in the end she allows them to sort of penetrate, as it were, because that's the only way that they can come to some sort of next kind of stage or understanding of their interaction. So I think that that's probably quite a good sort of salvaging of the sort of adversarial sort of international relations sort of warring narrative that the book begins with, that it actually kind of redeems itself through this way. But again, I haven't read the last book, so I don't know, but yeah, it sounds promising.
Yeah, hopefully you will get the time to read it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm aware of the time, Isabel, and you must be feeling a need for some comfort break at the moment. But if there are any other questions, is anybody, maybe we can, does anybody have any? Or maybe I will say thank you very much, Isabel, once again. It's been
thank you.
And really appreciate your time. And I can see hands up, and I know, yes, many hands up. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your
Sepideh.
time and your important contribution. And we're really wishing you the best. And hopefully we can work with you again. And thanks
so
everyone
much.
for participation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Those
lot.
great questions as well. Really brilliant. Thank you very much for being here.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, hope to see you again. And yes.
Yeah, same to you all. Cheers. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.